What's up, guys? How are you all doing? All right, I've got a bunch of news to relay all at once. For starters, I'm here with a very good and dear friend of mine, the illustrious Sam Tang.
How's it going, everybody?
Sam, if you have not heard of him, used to host an incredible podcast. It was actually the origin story of our friendship. I'm not sure what year you got started, Sam.
I think it was 2016.
2016. So a few years after Sam got started, or maybe just one, it might have been 2017, Sam contacted me, as he did so many other luminaries and old people in the Magic ecosystem, and asked me if I was interested in participating in a podcast, an interview about Magic's origin stories. And I was delighted to give that interview. And after a little bit of conversation back and forth, Sam and I sat down literally at my kitchen table.
Oh, yeah.
At my house in Seattle, and we had what amounted to, I think, a roughly 4-hour conversation.
Yeah, on equipment that was much less high-tech than what we have in front of us right now.
Yeah, speaking of that equipment, Sam is an audiophile. One of the many hats he wears as both a podcast producer and a marketer is that he knows a hell of a lot about recording and podcasting technology. So a couple months ago, I expressed some interest that I had towards Sam about creating my own podcast and my own podcasting platform and recording platform. So with Sam's help, I've put together what I can only call a pretty state-of-the-art recording studio.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We got some really great stuff up in here. A Rode Podcaster Pro. We got some Shure SM7Bs, actually a small army of them.
Yeah,
so
three of these telescoping boom mics.
Yeah, it's really good stuff.
It looks really fancy, although it'll look fancier later on once we're actually in the space that's been appropriated for this endeavor.
Exactly. We're just doing a tech rehearsal right now.
Right now they're just stitched to my table. So it'll be higher production values a little bit later. For the time being, we're just going to be recording some voice and some graphics on the screen. Sam ran your podcast for 3 years, I think?
Yeah, it was 2016, very early on 2016, all the way to like late 2018. It was basically 84 episodes, 4 seasons. It was a lot of episodes. I interviewed almost everyone in the Magic the Gathering community. Yeah,
if you were a luminary, that was a original tester or a creator or a designer or a player or an innovator in the game's first 3 or 4 or 5 years probably, and maybe a little bit beyond that. You definitely did interview some more contemporary players too, including multiple world champions.
Exactly. I mean, we have Richard Garfield, Mark Rosewater, Aaron Forsyth, Gavin Verhey, you, Brian Weissman.
Kind of everything.
Paolo Vitor Damarosa.
Exactly. A who's who of designers and Hall of Famers and everyone in between. Kitchen Table Magic, it's still up on the internet.
Exactly.
For download.
KitchenTableMagic.org.
Is worth every minute you might invest into it. Fascinating conversations, fascinating people, fascinating producer. And in fact, when Sam and I first met, we did talk for about 4 hours, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And I waited for, I think, a couple of weeks, maybe a month or so before the podcast actually was released. And when it came out, it had been condensed down to a little over 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I'd received that treatment before. I tend to be verbose. I tend to talk a lot and fast. And normally what happens when I do podcasts like that or interviews like that is that the person goes and sort of hacks it all to pieces. And a lot of stuff gets lost in the shuffle because I talk in this cyclical way and I diverge into lots of tangents and I incept to multiple layers of the narrative. And it's very often hard for an editor to go and stitch it all back together in a cohesive way. And yet when I listened to Sam's production of our conversation, it was missing almost 2 hours. I couldn't even remember what you had cut. It was unbelievable. I was incredibly impressed.
I just took out the dead air, to be honest. I took out any kind of ums. All I did was just edit for clarity. I did not edit for content. Because to be quite honest, Brian, when you speak and when you tell a story, sure, yeah, you're verbose, but it's because the history is complex or the idea is complex, and you just want to make sure you include all of it. And so all I did was I just included all of it, and I just cut out dead air. I just cut out us doing the sound check. I cut out us doing room tone, and I mean, we talked a lot about a lot of things. I think at some point, we got interrupted, but the thing is that the core. I mean, I had to run a show. I had notes. The core of everything we talked about was intact.
And it really showed, honestly. It was a really cool conversation where I talked a lot about the game's history and my role in it and playing all the way from 1994 at a kitchen table, which was literally where my first game of Magic was played.
And our interview was also on your kitchen table at that time.
Exactly.
Which was incredibly flavorful.
Amazingly appropriate.
And what's really significant about that interview and also the commentary that we're about to do right now is that it's about the deck. And if you know anything about Magic history, the deck is Brian's fine-tuning of this incredibly complex game that Richard Garfield created with all of these different rules and novel. Like, the world had not seen gameplay design in this way ever before.
Never. Nothing even close to it.
And, I played, modern era Magic in 2014 through 2018. And I'm obsessed with Jund, red, black, green, Tarmogoyfs, Deathrite Shamans, Thoughtseize, Liliana the Veil. And quite frankly, it's just a mid-range version, modern version of the deck.
Yeah, in many cases, that's true.
And so it's a war of attrition. But when I've done my research, I said, wait a second, we're going back to the origins. We're going back to the source. So, and I said it in my interview then, and I say it in my interview now, like, it's incredibly fascinating to hear from the person who was there since the beginning talk about this novel creation that transformed the way so many people have thought about Magic. Modern players don't even really understand, when they talk about card advantage, when they talk about tempo, when they talk about what's the advantage, are you attacking or not attacking? Like, all these theory things come all from the deck, all from Brian Weissman.
It's quite a compliment. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, it's really remarkable, actually, about how Magic design has progressed and moved along. The fact that you can play a red, green, black deck, which back in the day, back in the Type 1 era, as Magic was called when it originally splintered off from Type 2. So there was originally just Magic, and then I think in 1995, the format split into Type 1 and Type 2. Type 2 eventually became known as Standard.
Right.
Type 1 became known as Vintage. But back then, in order to get those kind of control effects, you had to tap and lean heavily into both blue and white. And not so much black and red, which were regarded more as disruptive and direct damage colors, more aggressive colors, whereas blue and white were the control colors. But in modern design, you can actually build a Jund deck, or in the case of my red-black commander deck, the deck that I think is unequivocally the strongest commander deck I've ever built, that we call Bolzat. That is a black-red control deck that plays exactly the same as a blue-white control deck from 30 years beforehand. To really show you how the game has progressed and changed and advanced. But speaking of deck design and blue-white, I'm going to jump right into this since we've done a few intros. Again, I wanted to repeat one more time. Check out Kitchen Table Magic. You haven't produced it for a number of years, but it is still as relevant and as good as it ever was.
Thank you.
And I hope one day maybe you'll produce something similar to it again, should you find the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you look in front of you guys, you'll see a deck list that should be pretty familiar to anybody who has played the format known as Old School. I've talked about this format quite a bit in the past on my channel, but I've never actually done a video about this specific build. And this build is, I would say at this point, infamous.
Absolutely.
I will relay a story real quick that many of you may have heard in bits and pieces over the years since it happened in 2019. I played this deck list exactly in an event that was called the Old School World Championship. It's an awfully lofty title.
And it was in Magic Fest Vegas, 2019.
Yeah, in August of 2019. So we're talking almost, a little over 4 years ago. Not quite 5, but more than 4 years ago. And I was introduced to the Old School format in 2017. I initially took my first sort of baby steps in the format on operating under a lot of the assumptions that I had held about the last time that I had played this format, which would have been about 2004, 2005. And the format was moving away from standard control and much more in the direction of tempo decks, mid-range, and combo was just oppressive and everywhere. And I got kind of tired of playing against endless combo decks. Patrick Chapin and I had this interesting kind of frenemy relationship at the time. And if you guys don't know who Patrick Chapin is, you've probably been living under some sort of rock. But Patrick Chapin also is known as the innovator in Magic. He's a Hall of Famer, a very famous and published author and esteemed thinker and one of the most brilliant people in the world. And when Patrick was much younger, he and I used to go toe-to-toe with me playing the deck and Patrick playing some combo brew of the day. We would play for hours after pro events were over or we were done playing with the Swiss rounds to a huge audience. And I won and won and won until suddenly I stopped winning. And I would say that I stopped winning a lot in the late 90s when enough tools had been created that made combo decks extremely fast and consistent and oppressive. And Urza's Saga really tipped it over there.
Urza's Saga was my first set.
Yeah, conveniently. Urza's Saga just made control decks feel hopeless. There were so many ways that they could just kill you, and you could not stop everything. And any one of those effects, a time spiral or a windfall or a time twister or a wheel or a Yawgmoth's Will or a Mind Twist. It's just too many things to stop. And it became, honestly, not very fun to play Control anymore. And so I kind of meandered off into different formats. But I never stopped thinking about Control. There was a guy named Oscar Tan who used to go and update a list that it was based on his, I think he wrote Schools of Magic, or was that, no, that was Rob Hahn, I think. Rob Hahn wrote Schools of Magic, but Oscar Tan kind of picked up the torch and ran with it for years, and he would write to me from time to time to get an updated version of the deck. And I kept that list current until about, I think, 2005 or 2006. And then at that point, I wasn't playing as much Magic anymore, and it didn't really make any sense to curate that deck list. So the last published version of the deck, created by me, was probably online around 2005 or 2006. And I went dormant for about 12 years while I played other formats, mostly singleton formats that I've talked about on this channel. But in 2017, I came back to the format because of this old school format that had been pioneered in Sweden, I think around 2010 or 2009. A bunch of Swedes got together in a bar at Gothenburg University, I think, in Gothenburg, Sweden, and decided that they were going to have a revival throwback tournament format where they got to play with all these cool nostalgia cards that they had loved and played with when they were children. And they created what is now known as Swedish Old School. And as the format began to become more popular around the world, it was modified slightly. And eventually one of the most widely recognized tournament formats was called Eternal Central Rules. I have no idea who or what Eternal Central is. It's probably lost to time. But Eternal Central Rules were particularly attractive to me because they had one card legal as a 4-of that had been restricted in all the other old school formats. And that card is the card Strip Mine. A lot of people played against Strip Mine and they believed that the effect of the card was antithetical to the intrinsic fun flavor of the format. Old school was supposed to be super casual and just guys sitting in a bar, drinking pints of beer, buying each other beer when they lost, or buying beer when they won games. This is what they still do to this day in the Swedish tournament called NoobCon. But if you're into the format for fun, Strip Mine ruins your fun. It sucks to have people strip mine your lands and you can't cast your spells. And so they kind of said, you know what, this card's oppressive and it sucks and we're going to restrict it to 1. And while that makes the format more accessible and it definitely makes it more quote-unquote fun, it also reduces one of the biggest skill elements in old school, which is balancing your mana base. Balancing your mana base, figuring out not only how to build your mana base, but how to attack and interdict your opponent's mana base. Because if control decks do one thing extremely well in this era, it's destroy lands. It's manage mana. It's a strategy that I've talked about on my channel a ton called containment. And the containment strategy, at the pinnacle of that, is surgical use of the card Strip Mine. And if you only have one Strip Mine, you can't do that at all. And then, of course, there's this secondary factor that Strip Mine as a 1-of means that lands become way more problematic, particularly the land Mishra's Factory, which is unrestricted in almost every format of old school. And of course, the Library of Alexandria, a card that I've talked about at length. In Swedish format, if your opponent plays the Library of Alexandria against you, you have 2 outs against it in most decks. You have a Strip Mine and a Chaos Orb, which means you're probably just going to lose. And making an entire tournament format where your opponent has a roughly 8% chance of turn 1 killing you if you don't have your singleton Strip Mine, pretty lame. And so I didn't really take the format seriously, at least not when I learned about it initially. But then in 2017, I learned about Eternal Central Rules, where you could play with 4 Strip Mines, and I got to work. And I built initially kind of a recreation of my old deck that used quite a bit of red. I had a Shivan Dragon as a finisher. And back in the day, we used Mirror Universe as the primary finisher in the deck. It famously had 2 Sarah Angels in it, but the Mirror was really how you won most games, because the Mirror had multiple interactions with the rules of the time, primarily the fact that mana burn was still a thing, and more importantly, you did not die till the end of a phase. So if you mana burned yourself during your opponent's end step down to 1, you could enter your upkeep at 1 life, and the first thing that happens is you're in your upkeep before they can do anything, since they can't burn you between the mana burn and the untap step and the upkeep step. And in the upkeep step, you could tap City of Brass, reducing yourself to 1, let it resolve at 0, but you're not dead till the end of the phase, and then you'd swap life with Mirror Universe. And you'd hand them your 0 life, and you'd take their life total, and you just win on the spot. Very powerful and effective, easy way to win the game. Of course, with the modern templating rules, which old school uses, you can no longer live through a phase, or till the end of the phase if you go to 0. If you go to 0, you die instantly as a state-based effect. So Mirror Universe, no longer a win condition. I had initially used Shivan Dragon as a result of that. I needed a big finisher, but the Shivan is awkward and clunky and isn't really a particularly good way to close out a game. So I eventually stripped Shivan Dragon out of the deck and eventually decided to remove all the red elements entirely except for a singleton Fireball. And that allowed me to move the deck more heavily into Esper colors, blue, white, black, the classic control colors. And after iterating on the format, I played in a bunch of tournaments in 2017. I played in GP Vegas or Magic Fest Vegas in 2018. Did okay, but I think I ran poorly. And the deck just didn't feel quite right yet. So in 2019, I came back with my masterpiece, with my old school masterpiece. All of my testing had shown that this deck was just titanic in power level. It was incredibly strong. It was beating everything consistently in testing, and I was ready to go crush the old school world championship. So I brought this deck with me. However, it had one change to it. I had moved, and this is the deck list right here, I had moved the Ivory Tower from the main deck into the sideboard. I ran a main deck Ivory Tower in 2018. I decided I didn't need it main deck, and I wanted something else in there. And after thinking for a while, I eventually settled. I think I brought Balance in from the main deck and moved the tower into the sideboard. And I had more artifact kill. I had 2 Divine Offerings and a Dust to Dust in most of my testing. And the night before the tournament, we did a bunch of round robin testing, just some friends in Vegas, and it beat everything there fine. And I was thinking, okay, I've got control decks down. I can beat control decks because of some other advances that I had made in my sideboard. The point of weakness, as far as I could discern it, was a vulnerability to mono red. I was really, really worried about mono red decks because testing had shown that the first game against mono red was super dicey. Mono red decks in this format tend to run a mixture of quick goblins, although they don't run very much, but they run a ton of burn. Fallen Empires is legal, so they can play Goblin Grenade. They play with Ball Lightning from the Dark, and a lot of them run main deck Bloodman, which is really dangerous. They also have Black Vice and Ankh Mishra. So they attack you with both red damage and with artifacts. And the combination of those two things against a deck that only runs one main deck life gain spell normally, as well as Swords to Plowshares, doesn't run very many counter spells, has a ton of mana, and is designed to play a very long game where it doesn't play Mirror Universe quickly and swap life, but rather you beat your opponent down with Mishra's Factories in the late game. You can really lose to mono red. They get to draw a lot of their deck, and it's hard to stop it all. I talked to multiple friends of mine, reached out to multiple friends of mine who are respected thinkers and minds in the space about what should I do? Should I play with 2 Circle Protection red, or should I play with 1? Should I play with 2? Should I play with 1? I was back and forth and back and forth. And I hadn't even figured it out on the day before the tournament. But I woke up in the morning, I was showering at 8:30 in the morning or something. I had to be at the tournament site in an hour. And I decided, you know what? I'm just going to run a second COP red. I have to run a second COP red on the sideboard because I don't want to lose in those early rounds to mono red. It's a very cheap deck to construct. It's very easy to play. I don't want to be down a game automatically and then have only 1 Circle Protection red in the sideboard against these mono red decks. Because if you're maybe no better than 25 to 30% to win game 1, you better sure as hell make sure you win games 2 or and 3. Because if you take 1 loss in Swiss, and it was a 6-round Swiss before the top 8, your odds of making top 8 with an early loss are very low. And I did not want to lose in those early rounds. And so it finally sort of coalesced in my mind, I needed to run a second COP red. So I wanted to run a beta one. If you notice this whole deck right here, and I haven't gotten into the deck list yet, we'll probably make a second video about that since this is an introductory video for the actual deck tech. But you'll notice all the cards that can be beta are beta, and that includes Circle Protection red. But I only had one of them with me that was beta, and they had an area with vendors and stuff, but I didn't think I'd have enough time. So I reached out to friends of mine and said, hey, do you have a beta COP red I could borrow for the tournament? Nobody had one. So I went to the event still kind of with it up in the air. I kind of decided I'll play a second beta COP red if I can get one before the tournament starts. Otherwise, I'll just run the Dust to Dust. So I'm sitting around filling out my deck registration list, which is what I expected would happen in the tournament. And while I'm sitting there filling it out, my friend Daniel Chang runs up and he takes a look at me filling out the deck registration list and he goes, Brian, why are you filling that out? They're not using deck lists for the tournament. And I went, what are you talking about? It's the old school world championships. It'd be a little weird to have a tournament called that doesn't have deck registration.
Yeah, the DCI is going to come and be like, where is your registration deck list?
Precisely. It's been tournament vernacular since at least 1995,
exactly, yeah.
96.
Exactly.
Unheard of. Every old school event I had played in, and I had played in maybe 3 or 4 tournaments at that point, all used deck registration. So I went, well, can you go check and make sure? So Dan runs off and he comes back and he goes, yeah, I confirmed it. there's no deck registration list. So I go, okay, fine. I guess I will. I guess I don't really need this.
We're in a new era of Magic. These are Magic Fests.
Yeah, these are Magic Fests, and it was casual rules enforcement. Every event that wasn't a sanctioned event in that tournament, because there's no sanctioning for old school, was played with what's called casual rules enforcement, which is the rules enforcement that they use at pre-releases, where there are no rules basically. You can trade with your friends. You can modify. Well, maybe you can't do that, but you can modify your deck at will. There's no sideboard, etc.
Continuous building.
Continuous building. You can modify your deck. So literally in this tournament, it would have been completely legal to come there with like, I don't know, just do whatever you want. You could just like swap your deck and change it whatever you want. You can modify it before the games. And I'm sure people did that. They knew that they were going to be playing against a mono red deck, and they're like, put blue blast into their deck. There's no rules that say you can't do it. Anyway, of course, I followed just the regular floor rules, which say you can't do that. And I didn't actually even know it was casual rules enforcement at the time, which is why I assumed it had deck lists. And the thing is that actually right before Daniel walked up, this other friend of ours, this guy named Jeremy, came by, and he was taking a look at my deck as well. And I was filling out the sheet, and I asked him if he had a beta COP red, and he goes, why, yes, I do. And I went, cool, give it to me. So, may I borrow it? So I borrowed the second Circle Protection red, and I leaned over to write on my deck list 2 next to the COP red slot, which was still at this point. The whole list is filled up except for that slot, which had nothing in it at the time. And I wrote down 2, and little did I know that Jeremy took a photo over my shoulder of the deck list right before I drew the 2 there. So his photo of my deck list had a blank next to COP red. So funny when you consider what's going to come later. So I wrote down 2, and then I learned from Daniel Red afterward that the deck list photos were not being collected. So I just threw the deck list in the trash. There's no reason to have it anymore. And the tournament starts, and I go win, win, win. And in round 4, I play against a mono red deck, piloted by a woman named Athena Froelich, who is Eric Froelich's. Eric Froelich is a famous Hall of Fame Magic player and poker player. And Athena and Eric were married to each other. And Athena and I played our match. We had an awesome match. She was a really fun opponent. We had a great time. We joked and talked about the format and about her experience as I guess she's a bit of a Magic influencer, although not much of a player. And in game 2, and I managed to beat her in game 1, despite the fact that Athena was playing mono red, exactly the sort of deck I predicted. And I beat her quite handily in game 1. And in game 2, I brought in a ton of ammunition against her. I brought in Tower, 2 Divine Offerings, 4 Blue Elemental Blasts, and both COP red. And the Blue Elemental Blast and the Divine Offering and the Tower alone were enough to annihilate her. I only had to really play around Blood Moon, which I was able to do quite easily. I took a fair amount of damage, got to single-digit life total, but I was never really in danger. And eventually I had 2 Jam Day Tomes and Library out and Ivory Tower, and I was drawing 4 cards a turn while I had Tower in play. So I was gaining like 6-7 life a turn, and my life total went up into high double digits, like over 20. And deep in my deck, a few turns before I killed her, I drew the first Circle Protection red. And when I put it into play, we both laughed about it. Because it was so, at that point she had no cards in hand.
Right.
And in fact, it was so obsolete that on the next turn, she top decked Ball Lightning, played it, and attacked me with it. And I just reached over and adjusted my life total. I didn't even bother to use the COP because it did not matter. The game was completely over. And the next turn, at the end of her turn, I drew 3 cards at the end of the turn, gained a bunch of life off Tower, drew the second Circle Protection red, and I put it into play, and we laughed about it again, and there were 2 in play. And I proceeded to finish her off with Factories. I won round 5, and then I won round 6, so I was undefeated, and I was 6-0. And I was pumped, because this was the old school World Championships. And on the biggest stage that really exists in the format, except for maybe NoobCon, I had just gone undefeated in Swiss, and I was confident that I was going to win the tournament. I was playing extremely well, just in the zone, and the deck was just humming. And because I was the first person to finish in round 6, the head judge told me that they were going to be taking photographs of all of our deck lists for the website for publicity reasons on the Channel Fireball site. And in my mind, I thought, okay, that's awesome, because this is going to be the first time, this is 2019, I haven't published a deck list in 14 years online, roughly. This will be the first data point for Brian Weissman's The Deck.
Especially because you've been tinkering with it for so many years.
Yeah, for years. I mean, in the back of my head, I had certainly referenced it. I hadn't played it for a while, but I had been working on old school at this point for 3 solid years. And this was my opus, my sort of second coming as a player. And I'd gone undefeated, and I thought that I was going to likely win the tournament. So the head judge brought me over to the table, and he said, we'd like to take a picture of your deck list. And I went, okay, cool. Well, I'm going to modify it, because The reason why this is just a photo, and I know that this photo is going to go on the Channel Fireball site, and it will become a data point in 2019 for Brian Weissman's The Deck going forward. I want it to reflect my best work as best I understood it. There's no rules to prevent it. There's no rules that say you can't submit a deck list. Aren't even defined in any rules that exist anywhere. They don't mean anything. So I decided to revert a change that I had made from my testing. I decided to remove the circle protection red and replace it with a dust to dust for the deck list photo. So at least that would be the reference point going forward. And then, of course, once the Swiss rounds or the final top 8 rounds began, I was required to revert my deck back to this configuration, as you see in front of you.
That you played in the Swiss.
Right, that I played in the Swiss rounds, even though, honestly, the floor rules didn't even require me to do that, because there are no floor rules for casual rules enforcement. You can change your deck however way you want to. Either way, I felt obligated to revert it back to this version, and this is what I played in the finals, or I'm sorry, in the top 8. And everything was cool. I won't tell you what happened, because I don't want to spoil what transpired afterward. Some of you may have heard about it, but that's the backstory of what happened at GP Vegas, or Magic Fest 2019 and the Old School World Championship. So I'm going to end this video for now, and Sam and I are going to do a deck tech of the actual deck list. And then guess what, guys? I've been teasing it for more than 4 years, not just here, but on other channels as well. We're going to do commentary on the top 8 matches from that event.
You finally have the footage.
The quarterfinals, the semifinals, and the finals. Well, I've had the footage all along.
And these are great games to do commentary on.
They're amazing games to do commentary on. They're completely unedited. They were filmed.
It's a master class.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It is a master class. If you want to know how to play old school, specifically the deck, it is a master class.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that at length. And Daniel Chang filmed. Honestly, he did a great job. He did a great job filming. He probably could have moved back and forth a little bit so that you could see both players' hands. But you get a sense of what we had going on most of the time through the flow of it. And it's shot with a high quality camera. One cohesive shot from start to finish. There's one breakup in one of the matches because it goes quite long. But I'm pretty sure you guys will enjoy it, whether or not you're fans of old school, whether or not you're fans of Commander, whether or not you're fans of the channel. You got a lot of awesome old school Magic footage coming up. Commentary from Sam and me. Stay tuned for that. We'll see you guys in a little bit.